Mr. Ambassador, I do want to thank you for this great opportunity to speak with you and also extend you greetings for the Day of Russian Diplomacy. I will begin by asking you, recently we heard that Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, has said that the Minsk agreement was simply a concession. That's the language he described it with. And he went on to say it cannot be implemented. We've also heard from Angela Merkel. She has said that it was simply a tactic to buy time for the Ukrainian army. So my question is, does that change the possibility of future negotiations, and on what terms would Russia be willing to engage in such talks?
First of all, thank you very much for your congratulations. Indeed, this day means for us. This is a day remembering the traditions of the Russian, Soviet and Russian diplomacy. And we have a lot to remember. On what you asked me, I think you already gave an answer, partly at least. Indeed, we heard these recent statements by Zelensky, by Angela Merkel, by Hollande, and by Poroshenko himself, which simply betrayed, they actually confessed that Minsk agreements were a hoax to buy time for Ukraine. And besides, Minsk agreements is a case of the failed UN prevention, because had they been implemented faithfully, nothing what we are witnessing today would be happening. But they were not meant to be implemented. So when people say, this started a year ago, soon we'll mark the anniversary, we say, you have wrong chronology. That started 9 years ago. 9 years ago, we were begging you to listen to us. Nobody did.
Now, we've heard from a number of Western leaders that they think the only way this war could end is with the defeat of Russia. So if that is the tone, is there any hope for negotiations or peace?
They are not just saying that it can only end with the end of Russia. They are talking now about dismembering Russia. They are talking about destroying Russia. They are talking. Some of the officials, high-level officials, are talking about the Russian leadership, whether it should be where it is now. Some statements go beyond not just simply diplomacy, but civilized communication. On a possibility of negotiations, our position is very clear. We stated it numerous times. We stated the goals of our special military operation, what it is aimed for. We were ready and still are ready for serious negotiations, which were interrupted, stopped by Ukrainians, of course on the order from their masters and sponsors in April last year. Besides, there are numerous statements by the Ukrainian high-level officials on how they see a possibility of negotiating with Russia. Besides, there is a law, a decree that was signed by President Zelensky himself, where he prohibited himself to deal with the current Russian leadership. So we do not see any serious attempts on the Ukrainian side to engage in any negotiations. And all those initiatives that we're hearing from them on the peace plan, on various summits, this is frankly a joke. Besides, we know for good that they are not calling the shots. Those who can enforce them for serious negotiations, they live in this country, somewhere in Europe, on one of the isles across the English Channel. If they are willing to do so, they will engage. But we don't see any willingness on the part of the sponsors of Kiev to go to negotiations with Russia and do it seriously. Besides, we are not negotiating on the basis of ultimatums that we hear.
Now, at the United Nations Security Council, you have repeatedly pointed out that pouring more weapons into Kiev is not going to bring peace. It's going to prolong the suffering, prolong the deaths. But we hear the U.S. representative just continue to dismiss everything you've put forward about the danger of lethal aid and weapons going into Kiev. Do you think that there's any hope for waking up the West about the long-term consequences and what's going to result from pouring all these weapons into Ukraine?
There is always a hope for waking up, but I'm afraid they are still fast asleep on that matter. We just had a Security Council briefing, which we requested this week, in fact, earlier this week, on the arms supplies to Ukraine and where does it lead. Enormous efforts, money that pours into Ukraine that feeds the conflict. You know that we invited Roger Waters to that briefing, and there were doubts that he could be a briefer on that matter, which he proved he could, and quite ably, I would say. He was not pro-Russian when he spoke. He spoke from what he thinks. We never, when we invite briefers to the Security Council, we never dictate them, condition on what they should be saying, not writing scripts for them. Sure. You heard what happened at that meeting. Indeed, so far this is a conversation between the deaf and the blind.
Now, there is talk of the Western countries convening some kind of war crimes tribunal against Russia. And if that were to take place, would it be possible for Russia to then bring things to the front and to go back to 2014, talk about the atrocities that have been committed, talk about the repression of the Orthodox Church and other activities going on in Ukraine? Would this be possibly a mistake where things they don't want brought into the conversation would suddenly be a topic?
We've been raising these issues all these 9 years consistently. We continue to do so, but you have to recognize there is an iron wall, an iron media wall, I would say. We are doing our best to bring that to the people. Recently, not so long ago, we held a so-called Area Formula meeting on what is happening in Donbas today and what has been happening there in not just all these years, but in recent months, because in recent months the shelling of Donbas, of residential areas, intensified enormously. 16,000 in the couple of last months, if I'm not mistaken. We brought witnesses, live witnesses, who gave their personal accounts of what is happening. All is ignored. They read their mantras from the script, not willing to listen to anything. Yes, many of those who are committing crimes in Ukraine today on the part of the Kiev regime should stand trial. And we are saying about that officially, that we are noting down all the crimes that the Kiev regime is committing against its own population, basically, and against the people of Donbas. We will not forget it, and they will one day or another stand trial for the crimes they committed, including on the battlefield, when they use civilians as a shield. We don't use civilians as a shield. They do all the time. When they commit crimes against the prisoners of war, even those outrageous things like what happened a couple of days ago with the killing, with the arbitrary killing, blank shot of the Russian prisoners of war, is largely ignored by the West. But the Office of Human Rights was forced to recognize that it looked genuine and it deserves being investigated.
Now, when Western leaders talk, they frequently reference this rules-based global order. That's the thing they constantly are speaking about. My question for you is, how is that kind of rhetoric and this talk of a rules-based global order, how is that viewed in South America, in Asia, in Africa? How is the world reacting to the words of U.S. and Western leaders?
We've been speaking about this rules-based world order a long time, saying that it's not international law, which is embodied primarily in the UN Charter. Not many listened to us seriously at that time. But now I think the opinion in those countries that you mentioned is changing. We just recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Colin Powell VL in the Security Council, which you may consider to be the beginning of the current phase of this new rules-based international order. We are saying to our partners that what is happening today you should look at it carefully and understand that today they came after Russia. Tomorrow they will come after any country that will be not much in tune with those who thinking they own the world.
And let me follow up by asking, what do you see the role of Russia being in a multipolar world that is emerging?
Look, the world is much bigger than the so-called collective West. The world is Africa, the world is Greater Eurasia, the world is Latin America, and indeed the world is becoming more multipolar and multipolar. Perhaps it becomes less and less multilateral on the part of at least a certain group of countries. But the role of Russia, you will never erase Russia from the world map, whether somebody likes it or not. Russia will be always a major player in the world politics.
Okay. Now let me ask about the UN Security Council itself. How do you assess the work that they've been doing? I know there have been calls for reforming the UN Security Council and the representation on it. Where does Russia stand on all of this?
We are not objecting the reform of the Security Council. That process goes a long time, more than 20 years, and that is not the problem of Russia or anybody else blocking it. There are such grave contradictions between the positions of groups of countries and of individual countries that we cannot achieve anything that could be construed as consensus sometime shortly, so to say. But we are saying that we recognize that the world today and the Security Council does not represent fully the world today that has changed since the time when the Security Council was established. We say that such regions as especially Africa, Asia and Latin America are underrepresented there, and that should be rectified. We do not see any added value in adding to the Security Council, especially as permanent members, of the countries of the so-called collective West, because we have enough of them already. And we don't think that they will contribute to the work of the Security Council anyhow differently from what we are seeing today. But again, I say the process, the so-called intergovernmental negotiations on the Security Council reform are going on in the General Assembly. But so far we are not somewhere where we can say we can achieve agreement on this reform in the nearest future.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you referenced that horrendous video of the execution of prisoners of war, and it's now verified, it's authentic. This crime was committed. What will it take for Western media to kind of start acknowledging the horrible things that Kiev is doing? Do you see any possibility of widespread acknowledgement of these atrocities? I mean, is Western media just not going to acknowledge these realities?
Perhaps they are acknowledging that within themselves, but they are simply ignoring it on the mass media. You perhaps, of course, remember such horrible stages as the so-called massacre in Bucha, or the killing of people at the railway station in Kramatorsk. On Kramatorsk, these unfortunate people were hit and killed by the Ukrainian missile, which was on the photo. Now they are not talking about that at all, but in the public opinion, it is the Russian crime. Nobody looks for the details, what happened, how it happened, what was true or not. So I'm not very optimistic that these horrendous crimes will be brought to the Western public by the Western media.
Now, recently, you talked about how Western leaders were objecting to cooperation between Mali and Russia, and that you used the term neo-colonial to describe their attitude. Why is it that they seem to be so bothered about Russia's growing relationship with Africa? And can you describe that relationship for us?
The relationship between Russia and Africa, with the African countries, where many partners there, is growing, and that causes jealousy on the part of those countries who consider that to be their backyard. I will give you one example. I think I will not betray anything secret by now. A couple of years ago, at the high-level segment of the General Assembly, Minister Lavrov was meeting the current chief European diplomat, Josep Borrell, who distinguished himself recently with some comments that raised consternation among the public. And then Borrell was asking Minister Lavrov, why are you dealing with Mali? Why Mali is trying to engage with you? To which Minister Lavrov said, look, this is a sovereign country. They decide with whom to deal. If they chose to deal with Russia, that's their sovereign choice. To which the chief European diplomat said to him the following phrase, don't mess up in our backyard. Can you imagine that?
Wow. Well, it is repeated in Western media frequently that Russia is to blame for the global food crisis, that it's all Russia's fault. How do people see this around the world?
There was a meeting recently, as recent as late January this year, of the EU Committee on Agriculture, where they gave quite a sober analysis of their problems in the agricultural sector, which is related to the pandemic, to inflation, to energy and food prices, to their hurried green transition, etc. So when it comes to themselves, they are able to describe it soberly enough, while for the public, they blame the current food crisis on the intrigues by the Kremlin. We are saying consistently that the food crisis didn't start 1 year ago, that it was the result of their wrong policies, which preceded that at least 3 or 5 years, including massive printing of money by the major economies, including their egoistic policies on food supplies, etc. So, of course, this crisis is not the result of what was happening last year. Now, if you are referring to the grain deal, or rather not the grain deal, but the Istanbul agreements, because they consist of 2 parts. One is the grain deal for Ukraine, and the other is memorandum on the export of Russian food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation. So the grain deal is working full steam. It's already more than 20 million tons of various grains that were exported from Ukraine, and they are not flying to the most needed countries, mostly. Yes, some portion, but very small one, like 3% to those who are really struggling with hunger. At the same time, not a single grain in singular, and very little fertilizers were exported according to the second part of the deal. Yes, the Secretary General, and I recognize it, is doing his utmost to solve it, but he's knocking against the wall, because there are so many sanctions. They keep saying that grain and fertilizers are not under sanctions. Yes, they are not formally, but freight is, insurance is, banking, financial transactions are, you name it. So that does not also contribute to solving the food crisis in the world, and it may even exacerbate it, because one thing is the food crisis and the food itself. The other thing is the future harvest, which depends a lot on the fertilizers. And fertilizers are Russian fertilizers, which are paramount for the future agricultural production.
Right, and I believe Russia at this point is being blocked from sending fertilizer to Syria. And I was wondering if this is actually being addressed at the United Nations.
It's not that Russia was blocked from sending fertilizers to Syria. It is that operators are not willing to do so because these fertilizers are considered dual usage products, which come under this infamous Caesar Act by the United States. Yes, I addressed the Secretary General and asked him to help solve that problem, because Syrians need it badly, especially now in these tragic times that they are living through. But so far, no, they have not been shipped there.
And part of the grain deal and the negotiations was that there should be a lifting of all sanctions affecting Russian agriculture. But this, from what you're telling me, doesn't appear to have been implemented.
No.
Is there any hope for this being implemented?
Hope is always there, but with the multitude of rules and regulations on sanctions that these countries introduce, in particular EU, they say they made some derogations, but in fact, when it comes to the national level, it is not implemented there. Secondly, there is this so-called over-compliance when companies are simply afraid to be sanctioned themselves for dealing with Russia, even if it is, in their view, legal, although it is illegal per se.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. I know you are very busy and you've got quite a task at hand, you know, standing up to all these lies at the UN Security Council. I want to say it's really been an honor to speak with you, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day to give us some comments.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.